It's, again, we talk about the evolution. We have the right to change our mind in agriculture, right?
It changed my mind.
We're a little bit like politicians,
Yeah.
we're like, 5.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Agriculture Podcast. Today we have Jesse Little with us. We're going to talk about planting season a little bit. You're probably familiar with Jesse if you're from the Purchase region of Kentucky, but if not, he owns Little Seed Company, which is a Pioneer dealership, and he's also a freelance agronomist. Works for Kentucky American Seeds, also works with Patriot Ag some in Mayfield, Kentucky.
Yep.
So glad you're with us, Jesse.
Thank you. Glad I got an invite back.
Jesse works with us pretty close here. I'm a customer of his, and also we just are great friends, talk a lot. So he's a natural guest for our podcast.
I got to ask, after the first podcast, were there any of those hater comments?
I don't think I actually saw any.
I didn't look, but
we get hater comments on the YouTube videos, but not as much on the podcast.
Okay.
I think people that like us actually listen to our podcast. So those are usually compliments and not criticisms.
Yeah.
It's always good to get some criticism, though.
The second half of that podcast is about pieces of tillage equipment, and I thought that if you get any haters, it'll usually be over pieces of tillage.
People
equipment.
get torqued on some tillage.
They do. Yeah. So I was curious if you had any.
No, I don't think we did.
Good.
You're kind of like us where, there's just certain times where there's certain tools that work very good, and there's certain times those tools don't work very good at all.
Yeah.
I think today we'll just focus on planting season here in West Kentucky and West Tennessee, Southern Illinois, and also just some things relevant to the Midwest as a whole.
Yeah.
That everybody can take away, beneficially for their operation.
Agree. It seems like we're still making. It's funny. We were talking a little bit ago. We're still. There's places you got 50% of your. You have 50% of your beans planted.
I have over 50% of mine planted,
which is wild because normally we're not that far along. I made the comment the other day. There was I counted them up. There was 7,000-8,000 units of empty boxes sitting out in our parking lot, and that was on April. That was before this rain, so that was on April. Shoot, I think that was the 5th or the 6th, and I'm like, that's the most bean boxes for the first week of April I've ever seen sitting out there.
Yeah, like I was one of the very first members of that Randy Dowdy's group or whatever. And he's probably been here in the Purchase region maybe 5 years or something like that.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I think before that, I don't think I'd ever planted a bean in early April before. But then post his group and all the, the learning I was able to take from that group or whatever, basically all my beans coming. I mean, as quick as I can get them in physically in April.
Yeah.
So that was a thing that's been most beneficial for our operation from his group, I think, was just that learning to, utilize that time to get the beans in early.
Agreed. Yeah. And what I've noticed so far this year is it seems like normally if we plant, this is just how different the year is, whichever year is. But it seems like if we were to plant the last 4 or 5 years on April 10th or 15th or 20th, it was still a good 2.5 weeks before they came up. What's been unique about this spring is, one, they're planted a week earlier than we normally plant our early beans.
Yeah.
So call them ultra early beans if you wanted to. But our ultra early beans are planted a week earlier, and they're coming up nearly a week earlier than they normally would. We're getting, in this type of weather, we're getting 10 GDUs a day right now. We're getting some, which this morning's cool.
Yeah, it is.
But we've had a lot warmer weather, and our early beans are getting up a lot quicker than they have for many years. So it's kind of nice because guys aren't sitting there waiting 2.5 weeks for the beans to come up. They're coming up in 2 weeks instead of 2.5.
Yeah, we talked earlier. There was some slug and snail pressure out there. So that's all, like when they're growing slow. That seemed to be when they're affected most by the slugs and snails.
That's the decision. It seems like guys have been bad. If you wanted to talk about anything in particular, it does seem like that's probably been the hot topic. Is we're still got some guys making some management decisions before they plant. They're sitting there thinking, okay, am I going to do some tillage? Am I going to no-till it? What am I going to do? And so if, we can spend a little time talking about that because that's relevant to what's going on right now. And I'm getting those questions a lot.
Yeah.
What do you want? What should I do? And we've talked about this in the past. It's nice to give recommendations that are not just an opinion. So my response to all those has been go out and put a slug trap out in your field. And instead of me saying, hey, I think you should go out and spend $13 an acre putting a guy on a piece of tillage equipment because that costs.
Yeah.
And going out and running them to dry that ground out so the slug pressure isn't as bad. But instead of doing that and making a hypothetical decision there, we've been putting out a lot of slug traps. So I don't know. Have you done one yet?
We just always lay a shingle out in the field, and let them crawl under it and see what's in there.
Have you been getting any?
There's been a few. I don't know. It's been 3 or 4 years ago, but I've seen as many as 25 under it.
2018 was the bad. That was the year everybody remembers. It was like the first year you'll never forget the first year we had southern rust really bad. Yep. I mean, it was wiping slugs. We were replanting double crop soybeans in 2018.
We replanted, lots of fields here in our shop's geography 3 times.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it was total loss of stand, like we had no plants left in the field.
Yeah.
They would eat everything.
Yep.
And even the third plant, when, it got on up into, I think, mid-June, trying to get the beans back in the third time, and still didn't get a great stand. Enough to make a crop, but the crop was limited because of the late planting and the thin stand.
Yeah. So that's been my kind of how I've encouraged some guys is instead of just taking somebody's opinion, hey, slugs are going to be terrible this spring. I've seen them. We were walking to church 3 Sundays ago, and we always walk in on the north side, and it's always shaded Sunday mornings, and there were slugs all over the sidewalk.
Yeah.
And that was 3 or 4 weeks ago. I'm like, ooh, okay, because since 2018 we haven't had them that bad.
Yeah.
And we've been cognizant of them, but we've really not changed our management. We've still been no-tilling our early planted beans and really not doing anything to address them. And then I'll never forget 3 or 4 weeks ago, I saw all those walking to church on the north side of the building. I thought, So I told Ryan Keith that works for us out of the store at Patriot in Mayfield, I said, let's put out some slug traps. So obviously some of those guys were like, I don't know what you're talking about. So we just, it's not nothing new, but we take a pie pan, pour a beer in it, and then we put a sheet of metal over the top of it to keep it shaded. And those slugs are attracted to that fermentation, I'm sure, of the beer, and they'll go up in that pie pan
and drown,
and they'll be dead. And the first one we put out, we had 10 in it.
Ooh.
And so then all of a sudden the conversations get started. And but what's interesting is it's certainly not been universal to every field because we put out some others and we're really not seeing very many.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're in the clear. But if guys are wondering, hey, what about slugs this year? Because everybody's chattering about it.
Yeah.
I would just encourage them to go out. It takes 2 minutes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Grab an old piece of metal. Even if you're not a beer drinker, I'll ask Neil. He'll go buy you a beer if you don't want to be seen at the liquor store. But you know what I mean. Go get you a beer and get you a little metal pie pan from the house and put it out there and just see what you got.
Yeah, I think with them things, we've always had the worst trouble the first week of May. That's seems to be like the peak hatch of them.
Yeah,
and haven't had as much trouble with them in early April as we have, the very first of May. So,
but it's been warmer.
It has.
I think a lot of that May has been because it's warmed up enough where it may be a little.
Yeah, they say we're 22 days ahead of a normal season here, so that would put them in like the second week of April or so, of which would be right now.
That's right.
I think what is today, the 10th, April 10th.
11th.
April 11th. April's slipping by us. So
it is.
We seem to be, I thought at first we were going to have a super early planting season and be finished in early April, but it's looked like it may be a mid to late April now.
Yeah.
For the second part of the planting
which will be
season.
Fine for corn.
Yeah, that's really when my best corn comes after April 20th generally.
Yeah. So I boil the slug thing. I boil it down to a couple things. If guys are listening, they haven't planted any beans yet, and they're still trying to make some management decisions. Is one, go out and put out a trap and see if you can find them. If you're not going to do that, you got a couple options, and that would be best use practices would probably be make sure you're closing your trenches.
Yeah.
Don't ever, if you're worried you got slugs and you don't know if you have slugs or not, but you've heard in the neighborhood you think you do, and you're leaving that trench open, no good.
Yeah. It's like a slug tramway.
Yes, it is. No good. So just good rule of thumb, make sure you're closing your trenches really well. The nice thing too is that, let's say you got a guy that really does not want to do tillage and he has slugs and he knows he does. Sometimes we would say wait to plant, but I've seen them last all the way up into double crop in 2018. Sure. So what would you do for that guy? And for that guy, you almost got to say, okay, if you're going to be dedicated to no-till, good work, but slugs are a problem. Okay, we got to make sure we close our trenches, one. And they used to just have a dry bait for slugs. So if you remember a product called, I believe it was Deadline.
Yeah.
And you would spread that. That was a slug bait, and you would spread that. Obviously, you'd have to spread it with a dry fertilizer of some sort as a carrier, because you can't go out and spread out of a big spreader truck. Can't spread 2 pounds of something, right? So you'd have to mix it with some potash or some AMS or something like that. They've actually got that similar product in a concentrate now. So at least it gives that guy that wants to stay dedicated to his practices, if slugs are a problem, at least gives him an option now. Nobody wanted to do the spreader thing.
Yeah.
But now they've got that bait in a concentrate. I believe it's called Slugfest. And you can spray it. Now, there's some guidelines. It needs to be sprayed at night, but at least you could go out there with a sprayer and spray that at night. If you're the guy that's like, I'm not doing any tillage, not happening, you got slugs, you want to plant early, you want to take advantage of that, at least there's some options there. So that's kind of how you progress through the decision-making process is one, see if you got them. Two, if you don't know if you got them or not and you're not going to take the time to do that, at least know there is something that you need to be going back when those beans are starting to come up and keeping an eye on them. Because how many times in 2018 did we plant the beans, we got busy and we were doing other things, and we didn't go back and we didn't look at those fields, and it was too late.
Yeah.
So the other piece of advice I'd say is definitely be going back and checking those beans. And a lot of those beans that got planted first are coming up right now. It's wet, it's raining, we're not in the field. It would be a really good time to go out there at, you're going to go listen for turkeys in the morning, slip by a field and see if you got them. Because I remember we were too late on a lot of fields. And now that there is a concentrate that you can spray, if we could be on the front side of knowing that, we'd be able to do something about it.
Yeah, preserve the stand.
That's right.
I remember it with the slugs, and we've always had the most trouble when it's cool and wet. Mm-hmm. When it's super warm and plants are actively growing, they can almost outgrow the slug. But if it's cool and wet and things aren't growing very good, and the slug can be active all day, that's when you can get in big trouble.
That's right.
They can take that whole stand out.
Yep.
And they must, I don't know much about a slug, but they must do something to the plant that, even once the plant has leaves on it, I don't know if they suck something on it or it damages it. So, it'll cripple plants too.
I think a lot of that is sometimes you'll see where a bean comes up and it's going to live off them cotyledons for quite a while.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, even if that bean plant makes it, that slug ate half of that
cotyledon.
Ate one half of that cotyledon.
Right.
Or it chewed on one side. Well, if it took the cotyledon reserves from what would have been, a full cotyledon, and all of a sudden it's ate half of that, I would say that would impact that until it stops living off of it.
Yeah, you can see that all slug damaged plants, they'll be crooked and not symmetrical and just not as viable as the healthy neighbor that hadn't been chewed on by a slug.
Yep. So we're getting those. It seems like if you're thinking about what's relevant right now, we're getting those questions a lot. We're still getting planting populations on early planted beans. That's coming up some, and we can talk about it. And then obviously the other big thing is, what treatments do we change that's different on the early planted versus the May planted? And so we can talk about some of that stuff if you want to, because that is kind of we got to make a lot of decisions. You guys make a tremendous amount of decisions in a given year, but it's amazing how many we're still making, even though we're already in the process of planting, and some guys are still trying to sort that out.
I saw where Clayton had something on his Instagram the other day that said a farmer makes, for any given crop, 750 decisions.
It's wild.
Isn't that crazy? In the course of a year for that one field.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it's that many, but when you start looking at all the options you have,
Oh man.
it is an astronomical
Yeah.
amount of decisions.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about seed treatment some and
Yep.
populations and
Yeah.
anything relevant to guys' decision making here in the next couple of weeks.
So I think we addressed the slug thing. That's been relevant to what we're doing right now with planting beans and our conditions. The population thing, I'm still fairly thick on early planted populations. When I say fairly thick, typically if you thought about a bell-shaped curve, if you were April 5th and you were June 1st, a lot of people would maybe assume your planting population would be this bell-shaped curve. You start thin because you've got all this length of season and all these things, and then you would get thicker and thicker and thicker throughout the season. I'm more of like an inverted curve, so I'll start a little high. By the time I get to May, I'll have the thinnest stand. Planting population I'll have all season, and then obviously as we move into double crop, I'll be back high again. But everybody battles that early. Well, what should I plant my early beans at? The thing that's got us is we've been planting a little thicker populations on our April beans, say like 150 to 160, because we were worried about stand loss because of the conditions we were planting in. And what spoiled us is we've been getting a lot of those.
Yeah.
Treatments are good. The planters are doing a good job. And I think we underestimated how tough soybeans are. So we're planting 150 in April and we're getting 150 final stand. You're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
And that's been going on for 3 or 4 years. But it seems like I always have to check the box. I want a good stand to start.
Yeah.
And so we've backed it off a little bit, but I'm still not May planting populations in April. So if a guy's planting 125 to 135 in May when beans are up in 6 days and it's beautiful out, I'm still not doing that in April yet.
Yeah.
You are, aren't you?
I did. Yeah, I got all the way down to 117 in some fields this time.
Yeah.
So, I felt really good about my soil conditions. I thought slug pressure is moderate but not high. And I just looked at the weather and I thought one of my biggest detrimental, yield drags has been lazy beans.
Yeah.
Jesse knows how lazy my beans get. And I was looking back at my op center and the seeded rates last year, and my lowest seeded rates were always my highest yielding fields.
Yeah.
And so I thought, I probably planted more at 130 than I planted at 120. But I did try some very low populations just to see if it was,
certainly
feasible.
worth trying it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I can always, if I have to, I'll reseed them. But
you probably won't have to. In all reality, you probably won't have to.
I didn't plant that many fields super low.
Yeah.
Most of them are planted between 125 and 130.
Yeah.
Which, it doesn't take many, yield robbing thing or plant robbing things to take that
No, it
stand
doesn't.
down to.
And every
replant.
replant I ever walk it's always borderline.
Yeah.
It's never like, yes, replant or no way.
Yeah,
it's always borderline. And I think part of it is too, you probably deal with this with your dad a little bit whenever you started. Because there's always a dynamic at every farm you go to. You got a couple things. If a guy's not been planting early planted beans, he was doing that because he was fearful for a stand of beans.
Yeah.
And whether it's your dad or it's somebody in the operation, God, you better get a good stand of beans. That especially the guys that are doing it for the first couple years, you almost leave that planting population a little elevated, so you get buy-in that you can get a good stand of beans planted April 5th. Because some of the guys that have not been doing it, that's the reason they're not doing it. You won't ever get a stand of beans if you plant it the 5th of April. So as a guy that makes recommendations, I typically leave them a little elevated, not because of seed sales.
Yeah.
Because I think they have to get it through their mind that you can get a good stand of beans.
Yeah.
Planted April 5th. And then we'll gradually work our way back. But I'm still planting them thicker than I am my May beans.
Dad likes, he would like to see everything planted between 150 and 180 because he likes to see that perfect, symmetrical uniform stand that grows really fast because it's competing
That's
against
right.
its neighbor plant.
Yeah.
And I would say in a perfect world, like where you could regulate rainfall and everything, that would be optimal because you've got lots of plants out there. But we typically get a lot of rain in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
Our beans are just now like, filling their pods then, and they end up getting too tall.
Yeah.
And then they fall.
Yeah.
And then you lose 20 or 30% of your yield.
Yeah.
So
The planting early helps that a little bit.
yeah, it does. I mean, it just gives them. I think, especially if the weather stays cool into May, it kind of just naturally shortens.
It
them.
does. Yep. So that conversation's going on right now, and for the most part, I'd say most of our recommendations are going to land between that 130 and 150. And guy that is really tuned into his planter and got better conditions, the 130 seems like it's fine, but there's some guys that are still, leery of that time of year, so we'll leave them at the one closer to the 150, and then that way they check that box. Hey, I got a really good stand.
Yeah. Ultimately, we have to get a stand, or we can't get any.
Still got to have plants per
Huge.
acre. I know there's compensation that happens, but and we're going to look at a few things about managing height this year. We're doing that a couple ways already through some seed treatments that got some PGRs in them. But there was also some foliar things that I actually heard at a meeting I went to, and I was grateful I did. I didn't come up with it. It was actually what's the
Badger bean? That guy?
No, the group
Extreme Ag.
Extreme Ag group.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a meeting in Bowling Green, and one of the fellas was talking about spraying their beans with sulfur, with a foliar sulfur as a spray in a really small amount, and
like ATS.
Yep. Yeah. So he was burning the beans and getting an effect like you would have back in the day with a Cobra or a Flex Star, something like that. But I thought it was actually, I was like, Mom, I never thought about that. So I was really grateful I went to, because I like the idea of doing that with a nutritional product and not a herbicide.
Yeah, I really like that.
And when
idea.
especially when you start looking at the expense that comes with that, and you're asking that bean to metabolize something over here, and it's a herbicide, and I'm spraying. I just like conceptually, I like the idea that if I'm wanting to set the beans back to get them to branch and maybe manage some of that nutrition a little bit better, then I think if you just leave beans to manage it for themselves, all this nutrition they have, they just get bigger stalks, bigger leaves, bigger stem. I mean, they just vegetatively get bigger if you leave it up to the bean to manage its own nutrition. I feel like. So sometimes, I mean, that's the reason we use PGRs and seed treatments, or the guys talking about spraying a foliar sulfur. You're helping that bean manage some of that nutrition where it's not putting it all into vegetative growth.
Yeah.
Really. And so we're gonna look at that, and I'm grateful he mentioned that, because it was something I never really thought of. And obviously we're not going to do it on a really large scale, but I mean, my intention is to go to several of my growers and be like, hey, let's do half a field with the foliar sulfur. And there's times you can do that. There's times you can't do that. So nobody take this recommendation and think they're going to add a sulfur with their foliar fungicide at R3, right? Beans can't be blooming. They don't need to be reproductive. They need to be in the vegetative state only. So we're talking about doing this early on in the year. You also think about, when you do something like that, you need to get them kick-started back. So burning is maybe step one, but step two is getting them going again. And so we're going to be adding a few things into the tank to be able to get that bean back up and going after we burn it with sulfur. But again, wasn't my idea. It's just I thought it was a really good idea to do that, because I've never liked doing that with a herbicide personally.
Yeah. I think anytime you apply a herbicide to a soybean, there is a time period there where even if it's not super detrimental, it takes a while for that plant to metabolize it. And if it's metabolizing that herbicide, it's not really concentrating on, pulling nutrition in.
Yeah.
It's just trying to heal itself.
Yep.
Just like if you're sick as a person, like all other things stop till you're, like till your body's healthy again. Same way for a
so
plant.
that we're going to add that as like one of the protocols. We're going to, we do a lot of planter fertility trials, but we're going to add that as a foliar trial that we're going to try to replicate a lot of places. Is for instance, we may look at that foliar sulfur spray application with and without some stuff. So we've got a product we use the fire out of a product called Catalyst. It's an amino acid product that we have, and I'm certainly going to look at that with, because you talk about recovery time and all those stuff. You add an amino acid like that as an energy source, if you will, in labor's terms, to that burn. You're going to get them beans coming back out of that sulfur burn. Hopefully you achieved your branching that you were wanting to achieve, and you achieve some of your height restriction by making the sulfur application, but you're also going to get it where you get some of that vegetation and some of those leaves that were burnt growing back a lot quicker. So that's part of what we're going to look at from a foliar trial perspective this year.
Let's talk about seed treatment a little bit
Yep.
and how important that is, especially when you're gumming in early. I think it's always important, but especially with early seedings.
Yeah.
So just talk a little bit about what you look for in a seed treatment. And like, I know for us, we're planting into tall cover crops, and it's important to have like a PGR or something in there with it to try to shorten the bean a little bit,
Yeah.
because it's just going to try to grow up past the cover crop.
That's right.
Competing for sunlight.
Looks like double crop beans.
It does.
Even if they're full season.
Yeah, I mean, like, you don't want them starting a pod, you
Yeah.
know, 8 inches off the ground.
Sometimes more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of good seed treatments out there. I'm not saying there's not. We use a product called Fortress. It's got multiple fungicides, multiple insecticides in it. So to me, that's a long conversation of why one would be better than the other. The biggest decision I have is most of the time those guys, you or anybody else, if you're buying your beans from me, we have a fungicide and insecticide package that we use. And if you're buying your beans somewhere else, they may be using something else. They're both probably good F&I products, if you will. I think the separation happens is when you start making decisions outside of or on top of a fungicide and insecticide seed treatment. So that next layer would be is okay, do I want to put a SDS, a sudden death seed treatment package, which wasn't even an option 5 or 6 years ago. You were just simply relying on the tolerance that your variety of beans that you were planting had. You really had no other protection other than the bean's natural ability to fight off SDS. And what's brought to this conversation is planting early, right? So thank goodness we've got some options that we can add as a layer of protection on top of the bean's natural ability to fight off sudden death as a seed treatment. I will tell you, I've evolved there a little bit. I started out when we went into April planted beans 5 or 6 years ago. I wanted the Saltro or Levo, on my beans. I haven't sold much of that lately. I don't even know what the cost is, but I'd say it's well north of $10.
It is, yeah.
Now. And it was then. And I'm not saying it's not worth it, but here's what's happened for me personally. We planted beans April 10th, and we sold a Levo or Saltro, some type of sudden death treatment on those beans as an insurance policy, if you will, because we thought, what would be the one thing that could really wipe us out on early beans? So if you're chasing 6 to 10 extra bushels by planting in April, what would take that away first, right? Sudden death would be the one thing that I think would take that away in that planting window, right? So we were Saltro and Levo on top of our fungicide and insecticide, okay? And it seemed like we were doing that for 3, 4, 5 years, and I've evolved into, if I'm going to spend an extra $10, I wish I could get something besides just sudden death protection, right? Because when you apply a Saltro and a Levo product, that's really all it's going to do. So in a year that is absent of sudden death pressure, which has been several years, we've not had a bad SDS year, even on these April planted beans, in a long time. We see a little bit on the end rows where we have some compaction, but it's not been one of those years where you walk out and it's like beans are dying everywhere from SDS.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
I think the variety selection has gotten better. Some of their tolerance has gotten better. We're doing a better job making sure that bean's working well in April because it's got a good SDS package. So I was starting to struggle making $10 extra recommendations as far as expense to you as a seed treatment, when really, if I look back, I'm like, well, if we didn't have a bad SDS year, did we get our $10 back, right, from that seed treatment? I mean, that was the only thing it was going to control was SDS. And it does seem like the last several years we've really not had much pressure. So I've started to move to, I'd rather take that $10 and we moved it to a product called, and again, I feel like I'm name dropping some products here, but just to tell you what we are doing. We moved from a Saltro Olivo package on our April planted beans to a product called Soybean Complete. And the reason I did that personally on all the beans I sell is I wanted some SDS protection, but I wanted a benefit even in the absence of SDS. Okay, where I didn't really feel like I was getting that with the other products. So if you were just sheerly looking at SDS protection, there's no doubt that Saltro Olivo was doing a better job just in the SDS category than the Soybean Complete. But so I'll give you, we use this analogy. If Saltro Olivo was 9 out of 10 on SDS, we would consider Soybean Complete a 5 or 6 out of 10. Okay, so it's not as good of an SDS product, but I was doing it cheaper than $10 a unit, and I was at least adding some level of protection on top of my bean. It wasn't a 9 out of 10, but at least it was something that was better. But in all those years, we weren't getting sudden death, and still aren't in some cases. And this may be the year, but for several years, we've not been. I don't think we've really gotten our value out of that $10 Saltro Olivo. So we moved to Soybean Complete because it's got a little micronutrient package in it. It's got a PGR package in it. So we were getting more than SDS for less money.
Yeah.
And so everybody's going to be different there, but that's been the evolution we've had on seed treatments is we went from fungicide, insecticide plus a $10+ SDS treatment to fungicide, insecticide less than $10 and get some SDS, but get something else that's going to provide me some value even in the absence of sudden death. So that's been the evolution we've went through, and everybody's going to be different. Somebody may be like, no, I want the 9 out of 10 SDS treatment because I get SDS every year.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's just not been the case for us personally. So we deal a lot of really leggy beans that don't branch well. So that over treatment package has some auxin and some cytokinin in it, which is like the PGR package of it. And it's going to manage some of those hormones where we get a little bit more branching out of those beans than we would if we wouldn't have it on. So that's sort of been the evolution as far as how I've recommended seed treatments on the beans that I've sold. And everybody's going to have a different opinion, but we've moved from FNI and SDS to FNI plus a little SDS and some other stuff that we're seeing benefits out of it. I feel like we're getting our money back and more even in the absence of sudden death because we've got that treatment on there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you can't go out there, or I don't think you ever need to go out there without some type of treatment on there.
Agree.
Especially early.
Yeah.
You'll definitely get that back in the tank in the fall.
100%.
Regardless of conditions, I think.
Yep.
It just makes the beans so much healthier.
And I think if I get a guy like you that says, okay, I got decent fertility, I'm planting early, and I've got some beans that get big every year, the first thing I would recommend is the seed treatment that's got a PGR package in it to help some of that.
Yeah. What I've found with the PGRs is I've never been able to find a correlation exactly once the plant's up to being able to shorten the plant.
Yeah.
Like I've never had success with it.
You're saying with a foliar PGR?
With a foliar PGR.
Agree with that 100%.
Like I can't,
No.
like every now and then I'll see shortening.
Yeah.
But I don't always see it experience it 100% of the time.
You'll see some cluster retention, in the nodes where it may have held on to another bloom or two because of that PGR application, and then it wore off because they don't last very long. But you won't see them branch a lot differently from a foliar application. It'd have to be awful early in the season.
Yeah, that's what I've experienced.
The easiest way to check that box is the seed treatment.
I agree. I think it, that seems to really work the best.
Yeah. So we're working, all those decisions are still being made. I'm still having those conversations.
Yeah.
Guys haven't planted many beans. They're like, all right, what are we putting on the beans? And we're making that decision right now.
Yeah.
And that's been my recommendation, at least in April.
Like when people are thinking about their treatments or whatever, I think it's also important to remember that, like, when we're placing that insecticide and fungicide on there, that not only the seed's getting benefit, but the plant's actually getting benefit once he's up. Like
Yeah.
he's got some built-in insect pressure resistance and some built-in disease like that the actual small plant can get.
Yep.
That will go on through the early part of
Yeah.
the season, keeping him healthy
Yeah.
until the sunlight starts to increase, and then the plant's got his own natural immunity.
Yeah. It's crazy. We don't really talk about bean leaf beetles anymore because we don't see them much anymore because of seed treatments. Last year, I had a soybean trial in Sedalia, and we were doing different 2x2 fertility applications. It wasn't a variety trial. It was just, we were looking at liquid potassium on the planter for soybeans. And so we were doing that trial, and right at the end, I needed enough beans to make a pass. Well, all our beans in big paper sacks come in untreated. Just like the Pro boxes come in untreated, and we run them through a treater at our facility, and when you get them, they are treated, but when we get them, they're untreated. Well, the paper bags are the same way, so it was an untreated bag, and I needed to finish a 6-row pass down through there. I didn't notice it as the beans came up. But we were in May, and it was good condition, so the beans came up. But what was wild is I was out there, beans were about 2-3 trifoliates on them. And I was out there, and we were making some notes on these fields, and all of a sudden I walked to this 6 rows, and there was bean leaf beetles all over these beans on 6 rows. It was wild to see. To your point, it's that treatment lasts in that bean for a little while. It's not like once the beans are up, the treatment's gone. And so what was wild is we had really heavy feeding on that 6 rows of untreated soybeans. And it's nice to have an experience like that because you forget about it.
Yeah, you do.
You forget about it until you see something like that, and you're like, okay, again, that's why we treat our soybeans.
Yeah, I was planting the other day, and Keith Myers called, which is if you're not from the Purchase region, he's from Gage, Kentucky, really good farmer, and he's got a son that farms with him. And he was telling me a story, and we were talking about soybean treatments, and he said that last year he had an 86-acre field or something, and Drew was planting it, and planted the entire field, got down to the last 2 or 3 acres, and just needed to finish up, and they were getting close to, I think, the end of planting season, so they just grabbed some untreated sacks and threw them in the planter. Drew actually said he'd forgot about it, and Drew said the minute he pulled out of the field that they had this huge thunderstorm, and Keith said automatically he just thought, well, that's a replant. Just before, he just, because the rain was so heavy. Well, he said he went out there in 5 or 6 days, and the stand was perfect, and he called Drew, and he's like, stand's perfect, and Drew's like, well, I'm going to run out there and look at it anyway. So he calls Keith, and he's like, yeah, I think the field's perfect except for the last 2 acres, and I can't figure out what happened. And Keith said, they were discussing it back and forth, and Keith said, hey, didn't you run out of seed in that field? And Drew said, you know what? It was exactly where I ran out of seed.
Yeah.
And just that, that little jag of the field without treatment didn't come up.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, rotting or whatever they get.
You need experiences like that sometimes to remember the value of your investment, right?
That's right.
Because a lot of times we get guys that you start questioning what you're doing. I do that naturally at home with purchases I make that are everyday things we spend money on, and we don't. And then every once in a while when things get tight, we're like, okay, where are we cutting from?
Yeah.
And you almost need some experiences like that to remember. That's obviously, there's cuts that may need to take place on every farm.
Yeah.
But that's typically not one you start with.
I agree. I mean, there's lots of places we can cut fat, and seed treatment's probably not a place we ought to be looking.
No. This is going to get some people talking. and here's my disclaimer. What I'm fixing to say is not going to change my decision of telling people they need to put a seed treatment on, because I think the benefits greatly, greatly outweigh this next conversation. But I did see an article the other day, and I'm going to say, I'm bringing this up because we've talked about both things. We've talked about slugs, and we've talked about seed treatments. And I did see an article the other day come out of Penn State, I believe, where they drew a correlation between seed treatments and slug pressure. Have you seen that?
I hadn't seen that. That's interesting, though.
So if you think about, again, this will get construed as Jesse saying don't put seed treatment on your seed. That is not what I'm saying, because the benefits outweigh the negative. But it's interesting how Mother Nature will you fix one thing, right? We see this in agriculture all the time. You fix one thing and something else over time pops up as being a problem.
Yeah.
And that problem really started because you fixed this. And Mother Nature has a way of moving those targets around a lot, right?
Balancing act.
It is. And I did see an article, and I had a hard time arguing with it, and they drew a correlation between neonic seed treatments and slug pressure. And if you really read into it, it does start to make some sense. And so I'll give you an idea. We talk about beneficials out in our fields. So wolf spiders and ground beetles and all these other things. We talk about the beneficial insects that we have. And so I am not a spray and insecticide every time guy. Now you and I differ a little bit because when I get to the end and I've got potted beans, I want to spray an insecticide. Okay. Because to me, I didn't care that they ate some leaves.
Yeah.
I'd rather have the wolves. I'd rather have all my beneficials all season during the vegetative stages. But right at the end, I'm going to hammer them because I don't want them eating my pods.
Yeah.
Because stink bugs have been terrible.
They are horrible.
So everybody's got a different idea of how to apply insecticides. And I have some guys that if you cross that field, there's an insecticide on it. I'm not that. I know it's cheap. You can do one for $2 or $3. But I think there is a balancing act. And it seems like the guys that spray the most insecticides have the most insects.
Yeah.
It's just an observation I made. But I'm going somewhere with this. They made a correlation in that article between neonic seed treatments and slug pressure. And I'll tell you why they made that correlation. Those seed treatments stay viable through that bean's life for a little while once it's vegetative. If you have slugs that are potentially feeding on those beans, slugs do not die from insecticides, okay? They're not an insect.
They're mollusks.
That's right. So they do not, that's the reason we can't kill them with an insecticide today. So they're not going to be phased by the insecticide in the seed treatment. The challenge becomes is slugs actually have predators too. So wolf spiders and ground beetles and all those other stuff can feed on your slugs out in your field. Natural insects and stuff that are out in your field right now can feed on those slugs. And that process has probably always happened. The challenge that they proposed is that slug would ingest some of that seed treatment. It's not going to die from it.
Yeah.
It goes and starts crawling around, and you get a predator of a slug to feed on the slug. It could be enough treatment
To kill the
in
insect.
that slug that didn't kill the slug, obviously, but it could kill what's eating the slug. And all of a sudden, you have this unbalance of predator and prey
Yeah.
out there. And so, again, I'm not suggesting to not treat your beans because, again, it's no different than Keith Myers' situation you brought up. This equipment, this seed, everything is way too expensive not to get a stand. And we know the benefits of seed treatment greatly outweighs the random slug years we had like 2018, okay? But it is interesting. I just think it's interesting to look at Mother Nature's way of as soon as you look at try and fix one thing, it brings up something else. And I only bring that up because I read that article a little while ago. And I'm not changing my recommendation to treat the beans. No way. Not with the benefits I see them. But it is interesting to see what effect maybe it is having on another issue we're dealing with.
Right. There's a consequence to every action.
Everything.
You know.
It's just which one outweighs the other. And right now, the random slug does not outweigh all the other benefits.
Yeah, seed-borne illness.
That's right. It
all
just
the other
doesn't,
things.
for me personally, it does not outweigh. So I'm not going to change anything, but it's interesting to think through that of, hey, what? You ask yourself, sometimes if you just sit back and go, hey, why are we seeing more slugs?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I'm sure some of it is we plant earlier. You know, some of it is more of our conservation practices.
I think that's a lot of it, you know, like they have a lot of places to lodge.
Yeah.
They love heavy fodder. So if you grow a really big corn crop and you have a lot of fodder down there, that's just a perfect home for them.
That's right.
You know, and we've got away from like fall tillage here in this geography, and that gives them a place to overwinter. And we have really mild winters now.
Yeah,
too.
we do.
Hardly any, like one cold snap really.
Yep.
That
So it's
was
more than just even
It
if
is.
Penn State's onto something with
Yeah.
that article, it's more than that. It's all the residue we have, it's the timing of our planning, it's all
Sure.
that. But I just found that interesting, and I figured you would maybe find that interesting how they drew a correlation between them two things we talked about. And candidly, I can't argue with that.
Yeah.
It's an hypothesis, in my opinion, from my view, but they may have data that backs that up. But it makes sense.
It does. I mean, I know a slug is nasty, and like I remember when I was in 2018, I guess I was reading so much about them. Like there's a phenomenon with a slug where, like, if he's in an area where there's lots of vermin, like rats or voles or whatever, they eat dung from those rodents. And then, if anything ingests them, it gives a disease to the animal called rat lung. Which is like it's like some type of, I don't know if it's like pneumonia or
Yeah.
something, but you can actually die from it. Like humans can die from it if they handle a slug, and like and somehow, I mean, your skin's an organ, so
Yeah.
I guess you can take it in on your. Don't
Oh,
handle
gosh.
slugs. Definitely don't put them in your mouth. And then if animals accidentally eat them, they can die
Yeah.
from it as well. So it's like a crossover illness,
Wow.
So, and they have extremely slow metabolism.
Yeah.
So, like they can eat it once in their life, and I guess during their entire life cycle can be positive for that disease. So they're a nasty critter.
No idea. I never heard that.
Yeah.
Learn something every day.
Yeah, I remember about that. This is off subject, but it's kind of I mean, a relevant topic to a slug. There was a boy in Australia that took a dare off his buddy to eat a slug and ate it and got that rat lung and died that same year. That we were having so much trouble here, So don't eat slugs.
Yeah, don't eat your boogers, kids, and don't eat slugs.
For sure. They are nasty, nasty animals.
So yeah, that's just kind of I don't know if we addressed what you wanted to on the seed treatment, but that's been a little bit of an evolution I've had on recommending SDS treatments. Is I've kind of backed off the 9 out of 10s. That's all you're going to get to something else. So I guess we maybe talked about what you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk. I think seed treatments, like when people are looking at early plantings and they have never done early planted soybeans, which is kind of relatively, there's still people not in this geography planting soybeans early.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if they start to think about it, I think it's something they need to look at.
Yeah. So a lot of times it seemed like we would, if we had fungicide and insecticide in a SDS product like Saltro or Levo, after April we would leave those products because really your risk of sudden death greatly diminishes after conditions get better and everything else, and we get warmer and drier. But I'm not really leaving the soybean complete because it's back to that conversation we have about beans get too big, and especially in May, they get too big that I'm not going to leave that PGR package and all. So we're running soybean complete on beans well into maybe into double crop.
Yeah.
A lot of times we're leaving it double crop, but we're running it through all our full seasons, and we're not just looking at it in April.
We continue to use seed. I mean, till we're done seeding, we'll use a seed treatment, and a good one too.
Yeah.
We don't shy away from, like, there's a lot of things I'll cut on, but seed treatment, like I said, that's not one of them.
Yeah.
What was the other relevant topic?
There's not been a lot of corn planted yet. There's some guys that haven't run a planter yet, and so I mean we could talk a little bit about that. We've talked about 2x2 before. I guess the other thing I'd say is if a guy hasn't started planting yet, or if a guy's going to start planting, man, spend the time to raise those closing wheels on the planter when you first get out there, especially as we change over from beans to corn. And we talk about it every year, but I don't think a lot of guys do it. And so I would hate not to mention that as guys are starting to go to the field with planters, is take the time to ratchet those closing wheels up and get a real good look at what your planter's doing, not just from singulation, but from depth on every row, and how does your trench look, or do you got a lot of loose dirt in it, or is it not as deep as you thought? And it's just so much easier to do that than digging seeds.
It is.
Golly, I mean, we did that for years, and I remember in that same group, we talked about, hey, just raise the closing wheels. You're like, holy crap, this is a lot easier.
Yeah.
Before we'd sit 2 hours sitting there digging, checking depth, digging, checking this, spacing, laying them over to the side. And it's just so much easier if a guy would take the time to pin those closing wheels up and do some planting before he ever even starts.
Yeah, you know exactly where your seed depth is to begin with. And then once you have a base of understanding about it, then it's a lot easier to make those adjustments.
Yeah.
I think it's super important too to line those closing wheels up. So
Most of them aren't. They're cocked to one side or the other.
I mean, almost all the John Deeres, they have the bushings, and people don't take the time to.
Yeah.
I mean, it is easy to overlook to not. And then you go to the field, and it's one sitting on top of the trench, and one's not even doing it. It's just over there running, and.
And contrary to some belief, that's a half inch to 3/4 of an inch difference in soil that covers it, because if that closing wheel, it makes a valley and a ridge, right? And so if it's not centered, you're going to get a different amount of soil over that row every time. So yeah, to your point, make sure that thing is true to the row.
Yeah, even like in our cover crop, we're running copperheads on, and those are spring tailboards on those two deer planters sitting out there. Even pulled back in the tightest notch with copperheads, we're still, like having trouble closing the trench up.
Yeah.
Like even with the soil in perfect condition, it just doesn't do a great job.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I think it's a good relevant topic or a good idea to make sure your closing system works really good.
Yep.
And definitely if you have the smooth closing wheels in a no-till situation, it's just not going to get the trench closed.
And I think, the last thing I would recommend as you start planting is take the time to try something new that you're going to have to make a decision on in the fall. Because it's funny, you probably find yourself doing that sometimes, is you're like, hey, I could look at this right now. It's going to take me 10 extra minutes for me to change something, to move something, to add something, whether that's in your 2x2 or your depth or your population or your hybrid or something. But it's amazing. You'll be so thankful in the fall when you're starting to make some decisions again that you took that 5 or 10 or an hour amount of time in the springtime to do something different that took a little extra time, but now you're going to get to see how that plays out. So that's the other thing I just encourage guys as they start getting in planning. We just think about fast and speed, and I know it's important to get through your crop in a timely manner, but spend that relatively small amount of time, whatever that is you want to look at. Maybe that's something as simple as changing the population on your April beans. Maybe that's something as simple as adding one product to your 2x2 that you're curious about. Spend that little bit of time now, because I've done that in plots where I've got to the end of the plot and I'm like, man, I'm tired, I'm done. But there's like one little thing I may want to look at, and I don't think about it that day, but when I get to the end of the season and I'm starting to make decisions for next year, I'm like, thank God I took that extra 10 minutes to put that out. So now I have something other than an opinion to base my decision on. Do I want to do that next year, or do I not want to do that next year? So take the time now to do whatever that extra is for you. It'll be something different for you as it will the next guy. Maybe it's a different hybrid. Maybe it's a different population. Maybe it's a different seed treatment, whatever it is. But spend that time now.
It's hard to get better, practice-wise, if we don't challenge ourselves with new practices and new products. And I think it's so important to, like, we should be bettering ourselves each and every year.
Yeah.
So we're not, looking at the same. Every year is going to be a different challenge, but
I've always been grateful, and I'm sure you've been grateful. You've always been grateful that when you took that extra time, it was a little painful, but then when we're sitting down here and these microphones are gone and we're talking about, hey, what are we going to plant next year? What are we doing? What's in the 2x2? That you're like, oh, well, I took 10 minutes and I changed something here. Let me go back and look at that and see how it did. You'll always be grateful you did that.
I thought it was, I don't know if we've done a podcast since we looked at I'll go back and explain to the listener or whatever, but Ryan Keith Mathis.
No, we haven't done that. We haven't talked about it yet.
So last year, Ryan Keith Mathis, who works for Jesse and his group,
works for Patriot Ag.
Patriot Ag, did did some. I guess they weren't weekly tissue tests, were
Yes,
they? They
every
were
week for
weekly.
12
Okay.
weeks. Yep.
Okay, every week for 12 weeks, and then put you in a peer group versus your neighbors or other people in the region, and just showed your practices versus other practices. And I thought it was super interesting that the guys that were really focused on early season
Yeah.
fertilization just absolutely shined,
Smashed it. Yeah.
smashed it.
Yep.
And I think that was to me eye opening.
Yeah. This may be a whole nother podcast, I guess, but do you want to talk about?
We can just go into it. We're already right at an hour, so
Okay. I mean, we can do whatever you want to, but and you may want to wait and we can talk about, the fertility stuff, because that is a deep conversation of what we learned from it.
I think we definitely want to do a whole podcast about what we learned from it, because I think everybody can take
Yeah.
that nationwide. Anybody can take from that
Yeah.
study. It was super
Yeah.
interesting.
It's eye opening. And I tell you, and I'll leave it at this. It's, again, we talk about the evolution. We have the right to change our mind in agriculture, right?
It changed my mind.
We're a little bit like politicians, We're like, 5 years ago we were like, hey, this is it, and then we learn more, and then we're like, we change our opinion of things over time. And I feel like we have to have farmers need to give agronomists the right to change their mind, because as we continue to test, we learn. And when Hagees came out, we looked at all this late nutrition and all this other stuff. We delay this because we looked at these nutrient use curves. And every nutrient use curve we looked at from university, it was like, well, that corn plant doesn't use anything until it gets to V10, you know what I mean? And so we're like, well, I'm going to move my application of this nutrient from here to right before it starts taking it all up. And I tell you what we really learned from tissue sampling is that separation in a high nutrient concentration of a plant versus a lower concentration in a plant, that happens really early on. And the one that started lower never catches up.
It blew my mind.
You better jack it up really early, because from about 350 GDUs to 750 GDUs, which really isn't that much time, on the calendar, that separation happened then. All those plants had about the same nutrition in them, at 350. So 150 bushel corn had about the same amount of nutrition as a 300 bushel corn. Now, at the time, we didn't know is this 150 bushel corn or is this 300 bushel corn? But we can make those comparisons today. And their 300 bushel corn and 150 bushel corn doesn't look a lot different at 350 GDUs, but that separation happens that quick after 350.
Yeah. And I will say, just a shared experience is, I haven't had a lot of luck with the late applied fertilizers, and I have had quite a bit of luck boosting yield, I think.
Yeah.
Making sure the plant has what it needs early.
Yep.
So it does kind of correlate with that study. I just didn't realize the degree of separation that it would allow you, if the plant is absolutely loaded with everything it needs right out of the gate.
Yep. Yeah, you got to drive those concentrations super high, super early. And so that it goes back to our conversation about 2x2. That's the easiest way to do that, really. And you would see a difference in those guys. We had some people in that group that we tissue sampled that were just anhydrous and just dry fertilized. I'm not saying they're not profitable. Everybody's got a different way of getting there.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is, you could correlate not only the yield that they told you they made off of that farm, but it had a direct correlation to the tissue sample levels. I mean, if your tissue samples were higher, starting at 350 GDUs and on, I didn't even have to guess. You made more corn than this guy made.
Yeah,
right.
It really was an eye-opening study.
And
there was a lot of good growers in that.
Absolutely,
group.
yeah.
Like, it wasn't like it was some schlubs in there.
No, there was even last year we had some challenging places on a corn crop. I mean, there was some 270 bushel corn
impressive.
in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And those were the highest tissue samples.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to show you how how reliable.
Yeah.
Like, we want to criticize tissue samples, because conditions can skew them some.
That's the reason weekly is really important.
Yeah.
We would highly discourage any of our growers from going out and taking one. Even we get those calls, hey, come pull, corn will be yay big. wherever. And he's like, hey, come pull a tissue sample. That can be super deceiving.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it'd be better than nothing, but it could also make us go a direction we shouldn't have because of we're coming out of a dry weather or rapid, just
Yeah, whatever the
yeah.
situation.
So weekly for consistently, same days of the week, and for multiple weeks in a row.
I remember looking at like mine too, and you didn't get there wasn't huge variations week to week.
No,
Or
few
tissues.
nutrients like boron was.
Yeah.
It'd make big spikes and little, but yeah, I would highly encourage guys to do that again. We learned a lot, and I feel like we probably also learned what our biggest yield limiting factor is, and that may be a whole nother podcast. But it was pretty obvious to me, and we talked about this a little bit, that as we prioritize nutrients on the planter, it started at nitrogen, it went to sulfur. It's historically been phosphorus next or something else next, based off of tissue samples on lots of farms with lots of good growers. Potassium needs to be number 3.
Yeah, I can tell you just from my own farm, and I'll tell you, most of my potassium levels are 2.8 to 3% base saturation. We can't get them much higher, or I haven't had success.
You spend a lot of money.
I've spent a ton of money and not got any results out of it, out of my dry application.
Yeah.
So, and that was our biggest holdback on yield on our personal farm is potassium.
Yep. So it's about solubilizing that nutrition and putting it in that 8x8 box around that corn plant where it's going to take up the mass majority of its nutrients for the whole year. So we will change tissue samples when you do that. When you spread all that dry potash, yes, we're doing that for the next generations. But if you see your tissue samples from one year and you're like, hey, I'm fixing this, you're not gonna if your yield limiting factor was potassium, you're not going to fix that by just going, hey, spread me an extra 100 pound of potash this year.
We've talked about that. It doesn't work very good.
It's not going to work. I'm not saying that generations from now aren't going to reap the benefit of the decision you just made, but you're not going to change your tissue samples next year.
Yeah, we're not advocating to go out and stop spreading potash.
Not at all. No.
It's just, it's hard to address the short term yield drag of lack of potassium with a dry application.
No doubt.
So we got to look at other options.
Yeah, but we could actually go through that on another one. We can go through your tissue samples on that.
We will. We'll get into tissue samples in the next episode. Next time he has a little time, he can come down here and shoot the breeze with us. So,
I like it.
Thanks for joining us, Jesse. And if there's anybody on here who wants to work with you, give us a shameless plug.
Just call me at 270-226-4411.
Thanks for being with us.
You got it. Thank you, buddy.
Thanks for joining us on the Agriculture Podcast. Like, share, and subscribe.
Good work.